This was one of the videos recorded for one of the meetings at Ratio Christi at UTSA. Aside from a few minor edits to clean up the long pauses, the ums and the uhs, it's virtually the exact same video, but in any case, here's the video. Hope y'all enjoy. Welcome everyone to the second Ratio Christi meeting. This topic is going to be on the problem of evil. Today's guest speaker is going to be our lovely Tim Howard, who's appeared on Jubilee. It's a rounded series, so please everyone join me in welcoming Tim Howard.
Thank you.
Alrighty, guys. Alrighty, well, thank you once again for just allowing me to present, and to all of you here for coming and being interested in these topics. This is actually a topic I've spent a good amount of time actually studying very in depth, more in depth than I ever thought I would go. So what you're going to hear today is probably something that you have not heard before. And so I'm going to try my best to keep this presentation as engaging as I possibly can. But if we get into the weeds a bit, it's because I care about stretching you just a tad in terms of thinking about this topic. And because this topic isn't just purely intellectual, I want to first say off the bat that we are purposely only approaching this from the intellectual side of things. But I do think that once you have that in place, it can actually help to actually augment your emotions in such a way where they have an appropriate relationship with one another, and it can tie into the very real emotional depths of this problem. But again, you'll see how the presentation goes. But yeah, so my name's Tim Howard. Let me just get into a little bit about myself. So I have about 10 plus years of experience studying apologetics, and then more specifically, philosophy and theology and of the analytic tradition. That's basically where we just like to break down ideas into bite-sized pieces so they're easily analyzable. It's all about precisification and being as specific and concise as possible. And then also some science as well. And so the way I like to describe myself is like an independent interdisciplinary researcher and synthesizer. I look across wider range fields and I try to see how many connections I can make between them. And you're going to see that I'm basically doing that in this presentation today. I specifically run an initiative called WorldviewMastery, and our mission is very simple. It's to help Christians achieve mastery over their beliefs, not just the what of your belief, but knowing the why behind everything you believe. What are the reasons you have to believe the specific things that you do? Not every Christian is made the same. Every pastor, every bishop you talk to is going to hold differing theological beliefs. Why is that the case? And it should not be due to randomness. It should be a deliberate process. So, also introducing full control into how you defend your faith. Listen, growing up, when I was 14, I'm 26 now, I started to think about my faith very diligently for the first time. And I found that the answers I got to a lot of my questions just weren't able to be answered by my local church congregation. So I had to do pretty much the only thing I could. I had to go away and I had to research myself. And I went through a tiny deconstruction period. But eventually what happened is by the time I was 20, I had reconstructed a Christian worldview. I kept the core fundamentals of my worldview, but I learned to relate to them differently. And I constructed a Christian worldview that I could fully get behind, that I didn't even know I could be more confident in than I am today. And that's our mission, is to give you those tools to think for yourself also within the bounds of Christianity. And to do that, I actually run an academy called the Transcending Answers Academy. This is all about not just answer seeking or answer searching, where you rely on what apologists have to say or what other Christians have to say, but you actually have the tools yourself to know, why is that a good answer if I'm given that answer, and how to actually come to answers yourself. And as you see here, accelerating your ability and defend the Christian faith with a community built on cutting edge frameworks, practice, and support. So that's a little bit about me. So let's hop into this. What you'll learn today is three things. One, what the real problem of evil actually is. And then two, simple yet effective responses. And then how to address further objections that are inevitably going to come. With anything, beginning our investigation is framing. I always hit on framing. Framing the investigation does everything. How you frame from the outset, you're investigating something, largely determines where you end up. And I've seen a lot of bad framings around how to approach this subject, and really, really good ones. And so, yes, I will say, I will plant my flag in the ground. There is a right and a wrong way to frame how to investigate the problem of evil, and you will see that as we keep going. Okay, so the first thing I want to get into is, and this is not purely pedantic, this is a real substantive difference. There is a difference between problems and puzzles. And if you confuse these two concepts, you will do so at your intellectual peril. I know you don't want to do that. Philosophy in its recent years has pretty much taken on a tone of dealing with things in a puzzle-like fashion. But there is a difference between problems and puzzles. So at the outset, if we're calling this thing a problem, we're already setting ourselves up for a very specific way to view this. But I want to get into exactly what the difference is, what constitutes a problem versus what just constitutes a puzzle. Well, first, we have to define what is a puzzle. Well, a puzzle simply is a set of ideas that appear to be mutually difficult to reconcile with one another. They're not strictly inconsistent, but they might propose mental difficulties in us trying to understand their relationship. And so it might call for further refinement or clarification within an existing framework. Notice that last part there, within an existing framework. So you're not giving up anything. So notice the difference here. Puzzles don't necessarily affect the truth value of an idea, but rather there are some cognitive difficulties for us to see what might be difficult to reconcile on the surface. But as you can tell, puzzles actually leave room open to have that reconciliation. So the question is, the quote unquote problem of evil more like this, or is it something else? And that gets into, oh yeah, and then the purpose of these. They actually are really helpful. Puzzles are great because they expose tensions in our thinking. And then it pushes us to refine our concepts and our assumptions. Maybe we're making assumptions we didn't even know we were making. And hey, maybe we have a better fleshed out idea of what they are. We all come to the table of thought with multiple assumptions, uncountably many assumptions. And so it's good sometimes for these puzzles to arise. So here's an example of a puzzle. Imagine you write a 500-page book and all the claims in that book, yeah, you believe every single one of them. You're just like, yeah, this is my book. All the claims, I believe they're true. But then you also go, I'm a fallible person. So maybe, probably at least one claim somewhere in the book is mistaken. Okay, so some people might think that this is a strict contradiction, right? But actually, this would be more constitutive of like what a puzzle is, right? It's how do you reconcile human fallibility with also at the same time being able to get every claim right? That's basically what this is meant to show, right? And this is peering into the psychology of the person who's writing this book. So we don't actually have ideas that are logically against each other in this way. What about problems, though? Okay, let's get into the problems. Well, a problem is an idea that resists understanding by current conceptual resources, suggesting an inadequacy of the framework itself. So notice how with the puzzle example, we're changing things within the framework. With the problem example, we have to ditch the entire thing altogether, right? That's what problems expose. Here's an example. So this is the famous philosophical problem called Hume's problem of induction. Hume was a Scottish philosopher back in the day, and he proposed this problem, right? Hey, we rely on past experience to justify our expectations about the future. Oftentimes we call that extrapolation, whatever, right? And for example, the sun will rise tomorrow because it always has. But he goes, but wait a minute. There's this thing called being non-circular. We want to avoid circularity, right? There's no non-circular way to justify for why the future must resemble the past. And then any attempt to do so will itself be based on induction, the very thing you're trying to justify. Oh, well, I guess we got to pack it up. The philosopher's game is over. Well, that's really not the case. There's been many proposals to solve this. But what they've all done is they proposed frameworks. They proposed either additional or completely different rethought frameworks to get around this. I'm not going to get into this because this is not a presentation on Hume's problem of induction. But if you are really nerdy like that, there's plenty of articles online to go look at that. Neither here nor there for me, though. Okay, moving on. I also want to talk about something called anomalies. So we've just talked about problems, okay? Where if you assume from the outset that this is a problem, you're assuming that there's a framework that we have to ditch, that there are some logical incompatibilities, or there's some real tension that lowers the truth value of something, okay? But that needs to be justified. So again, we have distinguishing between puzzles and problems. We also have this thing called anomalies. Okay, so why am I bringing up anomalies? You guys have probably all heard the term an anomaly. Like, whoa, that thing that happened, that was kind of like an anomaly, right? Maybe it's an infrequent event that might happen, or something that surprises you. That's usually how we use the term. It's like an anomalous data piece or something like that. Well, here's what an anomaly actually is. An anomaly is something that looks like a counterexample to a theory. It's a case where the theory says this should be so, but it seems on the surface not to be so. So what I want to show you the relevance here is if the problem of evil is a case of a problem of anomaly, right? Notice what the definition says. Looks like a counterexample. Now, there's always two ways to explain why something looks the way it is. It looks the way it is because it does look like that, or it looks the way that it is purely by the subjective perception of myself or the person observing, right? Those are always the two explanations on the table. So when there's something that appears to be anomalous or something that has an anomalous appearance, just take that with you. So what philosophers have done is they've said, well, wait a minute, these anomalies happen and they don't just all come equal. There's a difference between anomalies in the weak sense and anomalies in the strong sense, okay? Well, let's kind of unpack that a bit here. First, I want to say that we have examples that we can use are pretty simple. Here's an example. Let's say that we have a theory that says all ravens are black, okay? Boom, there you go. Now imagine you encounter an apparent raven that doesn't look black. So here are some of the possibilities for that to explain that. The raven looks non-black, i.e. white or red. Well, that's what we call a direct seeming, right? The raven actually itself, the object that is the raven, looks non-black, okay? This is what we would call a strong anomaly because my theory said it should not look like that. It contradicts that theory. What do strong anomalies do? Strong anomalies actually give me a reason to not have so much credibility or put so much believability in the theory that I'm holding. It lowers my confidence in how true it is. So it actually negatively affects the truth value. Well, what about something like this? The raven fails to look black, but not because it looks any other color, okay? But maybe it's in the dark or dim lighting that makes it just look dark. So now we are contextualizing the appearance of a non-black raven. And it just looks dark, but not distinctly black. This is odd, right? We could ask, well, why is the light affecting it like that? But it's not a direct contradiction. This is what's called a weak anomaly. And having these weak anomalies don't actually affect, again, the truth value of a given explanation or a given theory. So here's what's really important to know about anomalies. Every well-accepted theory, I'm talking about science here as well, no matter how strong or well-confirmed, will face anomalies of some sort. Literally no expert or philosopher of science, philosophers that deal with the very logical and intellectual foundations of the scientific enterprise itself, will tell you that this is false. This is simply the case. And scientists are very accustomed to working within the realm of anomalies. Here's an example. Newton's inverse square law of gravitation predicted only about half of the observed progression of the apogee of the moon's orbit. And here's the funny thing. They accepted that for a very long time. They took that on. And the reason why I bring this on is being able to distinguish between a strong anomaly that might force you to give up belief or a weak anomaly that allows you to maintain belief is really important here. Because a lot of people think that something that appears anomalous gives you automatic reason to give up belief, that you are within your rational rights, that you're rationally obligated to give up your beliefs. And what I'm telling you is that if you're able to distinguish between puzzles and problems and strong anomalies from weak anomalies, you actually might find yourself in a situation where you actually don't even need to explain anything because you're within your rational rights to maintain belief in the presence of oddities. So that's the first part that I want to frame it there with you. So the second part is, or third part, wherever we're at, is anomaly mongering. And this is something that I see a lot in problem of evil debates and discussions. What you'll find is a skeptic or a person who's trying to show that there is a problem or a strong anomaly here. What they'll do is they will start to give you a long list of descriptions of suffering. And they'll try to describe as much horrendous and grotesque suffering in as much detail as they can. And what they're simply doing is they're saying, well, look at this description of suffering. If I just give you this description, and the more I describe, it should start to evoke or engender in you this like negative response, like, yeah, you're right, that doesn't work, right? Now that's just an emotional psychological response, but this is called anomaly mongering, because it's going, look how odd this is, look how strange this is, look how surprising this is. No matter how many times you say something is surprising or say something is strange, right, you still have to make an argument in favor of it being a strong anomaly versus a weak anomaly. You still have to make an argument in favor of it being a problem and not merely a puzzle. And if you were to take any philosophy class, any philosophy 101 class, they will tell you that the strength or the weight is always on the argument that is stronger. So we await argument. Moving from that point, let's go into phase one of the presentation. So we're now just getting into it. Okay, so here's the argument. The argument from evil, and philosophers of religion, those are individuals that actually deal with these topics in their profession. They have actually pointed out that arguments from evil center on what we call like a mismatch kind of situation, where there's a mismatch between two factors. One, the character of God. We often conceive of God as a maximal being, right? Maximally loving, maximally knowing, and maximally powerful. Those are usually the three traits that are ascribed. And then our observations. And this mismatch between them, the specific observations that we combine with the character of God can either result in what we call an argument from evil or not. So evils, our observations, look like counterexamples to the claim that the world is ordered by a perfectly good God. This is how the mismatch would happen. Now remember, everything stems from appearance. Either our appearances are explained by the fact that it is that way, or appearances are explained by some other fact. Either we're mistaken or some other factors that would make an appearance be that way. But at first we can all agree, hey, I think it's perfectly fine to say on the surface, evils look like counterexamples to the claim the world is ordered by a perfectly good God. But that's not the ultimate analysis. We still have to dig deep. So here's an example of how these arguments usually run. Super simple argument form. There's just 3 sentences here. If a maximally loving, maximally knowing, and maximally powerful being exists, then no gratuitous suffering exists. Gratuitous just meaning there doesn't seem to be a purpose or a point to why this evil is even existing, right? Premise 2. Okay, well then gratuitous evil does exist. There seems to be examples where evils occur and there is no readily identifiable, morally relevant connection to what on earth happened, right? That's usually the kind, and those are usually the extreme horrendous kinds, the kinds that I don't even want to get into descriptions of, right? Okay, well then following a valid logical form, we would say, well, therefore, then a maximally loving, maximally knowing, and maximally powerful being just doesn't exist. This is of the strongest kinds of arguments from evil, because what it's doing is it's exposing a logical incompatibility, right, between the character of God and this mismatch between gratuitous suffering, right? So this mismatch, the strength of the mismatch, is one that renders the truth value of there being this kind of being 0. Well, then we have a weaker kind of argument, but it still doesn't work well for the God believer. If a maximally loving, maximally knowing, and maximally powerful being exists, then gratuitous suffering is highly unlikely. So we don't need to say that it makes it totally implausible. What we can say is, listen, you have a strong reason to not believe this. And as again, Scottish philosopher David Hume said, the wise man apportions his beliefs or apportions his confidence to the evidence. If you have something that makes your belief highly unlikely, well, you should apportion your confidence to that belief in the same way. You should be very unconfident in that belief. Okay, so then if gratuitous suffering does exist, then the conclusion, it is strong evidence against the existence of such being. So either evils of this kind are evidence, strong evidence, or they are mutually exclusive. So what I want to show you is there's actually 3 assumptions made in every argument from evil. I've scoured the literature and I found that they all have some of these, pretty much all 3 in some variation, some manner contained within them. The first assumption is all evil must be necessary. If God's going to be morally justified in not intervening or not preventing suffering, it can only be because that evil must be necessary. It's the only way to get what God wants. He has to just put up with the evil that way. That's the first assumption. Assumption 2, what happens to someone is actually more important than how they respond to what happened to them. So mere circumstances dictate our identities. And assumption 3, skeptics and theists share these values. I'm going to unpack all of these assumptions. The first assumption goes by what is called a necessity condition. All suffering must be necessary to do two things: produce a greater good or prevent a greater bad, right? If there is some suffering and the suffering occurs and it's the only way to get some good, but the good is really, really good, like it outweighs the bad, right? That's what we call a greater good. Or to prevent an evil happens and to prevent an even worse evil that would have otherwise happened, right? And so a lot of atheist philosophers, agnostic philosophers say, hey, this seems to be a pretty self-evident thesis right here. Well, here's the relevance of this, right? It actually assumes that the best way to understand God's character is through the lens of what we call consequentialism, that the consequences dictate the rightness and wrongness of actions. Now, consequentialism is a thesis on the table, absolutely, but it's an assumption that's built into the argument from the outset. And like with every assumption, either you're justified in holding the assumptions that you do, or you are unjustified. And before any Christian takes on these assumptions, we, like any rational person, want to know, why should we believe that? Why should we believe the necessity condition or maybe something else that's on the table? Another thing I want to say is where arguments from evil are trying to perform what's called an internal critique. It's trying to think within inside the theistic worldview and see if there's any internal tensions with what the theist is committed to believing. A big issue with this is that the moment you start to foist assumptions that are foreign to the internal contents of the theistic worldview is the moment you are failing to show that there is a problem within the theistic worldview. So that's why knowing what all these assumptions on the table are heavily important, or else the arguments don't even get off the ground. So here's a rival assumption, right? And I would say that for, many Western monotheisms, right, many traditions actually kind of hold to this way of thinking. Church fathers, et cetera, and so forth, but we don't need to get into that in this presentation. There's something that's called a defeat condition. And this is going to rival what's called the necessity condition. Instead of all suffering having to be necessary, is that all suffering must have the potential to be defeated within a victim's total life. Now, we aren't just using the word defeat here willy-nilly. Defeat actually means something specific. There's an essay on this called The Defeat of Good and Evil, where the philosopher Roderick Chisholm talks about what it means to actually defeat evil. When an agent defeats evil within their life, what that means is that something has happened to them. Something has happened in their psyche such that the suffering that happened to them actually no longer matters. That the suffering that happened to them actually no longer negatively affects their life long term. And actually the suffering that happens to them no longer dictates the value that they see in their life, but actually ends up oddly playing a crucial role in how they value their own lives. If that happens, we would say that the suffering has been defeated. That the agent's perception of their own value of their life wouldn't be what it is without what they went through. And so what makes the justification of suffering isn't about what outside external good it connects to, but actually it centers on the sufferer themselves. It makes the justification about how the suffering and the victim relates to their own suffering, right? I like to think of our lives as being biographies we'll eventually be able to read back one day. And if you think about the greatest stories and the most inspirational lives, there's always this coming to acceptance with the hardship of the person that went through what it is. And it inspires us to live good lives. And so it seems that even some of the best biographies contain sufferings where the person doesn't actually regret what they completely went through, but they actually see that it made them the excellent person that they so desire to be. And they don't wish it away because they wouldn't otherwise be that person. Here's assumption 2. It treats mere circumstances more important than a developed identity. I think that this assumption is one of the easier ones to undermine, right? Because in essence, what it's saying is you are what happens to you, right? But we have an abundance of counterexamples where if we were to contextualize someone's life only within the bad things that happen to them and exclude the impact that person made in their lifetime based on such suffering, well, then we would have a gross misunderstanding of who that person is and what their identity actually is. There's a really good book by a author named Jerry Sitzer. He wrote a book called A Grace Disguised, How the Soul Grows Through Loss. And he recollects in that book how losing his mother, daughter, and wife in a single car accident all at once was simultaneously the worst thing that ever happened to him and also the best thing that ever happened to him. And he gives his whole story that way. It's very peculiar that something that terrible actually provides an opportunity for someone to find the greatest sense of meaning and spiritual fulfillment that they could ever find. I highly recommend reading that book. But the book challenges this assumption. If what is most important about you is what happens to you and not how you respond to what happens to you, then Jerry Sitzer's would not exist. You would be basically disempowering his identity, and you would basically be purely much objectifying his situations because you aren't looking at how he values himself and how he deems his life worthy. And then Viktor Frankl actually is a good example of this. He wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning, and he was a Holocaust survivor. And 9 days after he got out of the concentration camps, he actually wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning, and then which ended up spawning a brand new field of psychology, therapy called logotherapy. And he talks about how humans are geared towards meaning-making endeavors. That the famous quote is, there is a window of opportunity between stimulus and response, what happens to you and how you respond. And he says, and that window of opportunity is the last of the freedoms that can be taken away with you, which is the attitude you form on the basis of what's happening to you. Meaning you always have the resources to fashion meaning about what is happening to you in a way where you deem your life worth living. And for him in the concentration camps, that was using his knowledge of psychology to help victims who were contemplating unaliving themselves, saying that just in case this goes on YouTube or whatever with all the weird censorship. And that's how he found meaning while he was in there, which got him through. And he said that the key difference between people that found their lives in the concentration camps and lost their lives in the concentration camps was this one factor. Assumption 3, I call this the myth of shared value. The skeptic and the theist come to the table with the same exact values. We're all consequentialists. We all believe happiness is the highest good, right? We should all be happy. We're all heated. No, that's not the case. And the reason why this matters is without coming to the table about what the highest goods, what the highest values, what the ends of our lives truly are, no argument from evil can ever get off the ground. Because again, if this is to be an internal critique of the Christian worldview, or theistic worldview, whatever you want to call it, it has to play by the rules of the internal constraints of that worldview. It'd be like if I were to sit down with a chess player and I were to demand we play by the rules of checkers. And the chess player said, whoa, 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 you sat down at the chess booth to play a game called chess, which abides by its own rules. And yet you are demanding that we play by the rules of checkers. No one would take that seriously. But yet most arguments from you will actually do this. They employ many assumptions that are foreign to the Christian worldview to make an argument against it, saying that this is what Christians believe. And it's simply not the case. So let's talk about justification. There are two things that concern this discussion, what's called justification and what's called motivations. Justification is what makes something okay to happen, what makes something authorizable, what's allowed to go through. And we ask the question, how is then God justified in authorizing suffering, and not even suffering the most horrendous sufferings? Well, given some of the rival assumptions I put forth earlier, there are actually two ways in the combination of ways. A, ensuring the defeat of all suffering in every victim's life, and B, infinitely compensating their suffering. Let's start to talk about A. Ensuring the defeat of suffering in every victim's life. What does this mean? What it basically means is what I said earlier, where every victim will come to a retroactive understanding. They will be able to look back at their life one day in their lifetime, and be able to say, what I went through was hard, but actually I see how it contributed to the value of my identity, and I actually do not regret what happened to me. And then 2, and I actually see how God was there with me the entire time and how he loves me. B, and then being infinitely compensated for their suffering, where being in the very presence of God and in full union with God actually infinitely outweighs anything they went through, where it renders even the worst of their sufferings infinitely small. And this actually has a positive feedback loop, because the more compensation, the easier it is for someone to heal, and the easier it is for them to not deem their total existence not worth living. Remember, this is a sufferer-centric approach to justification. When we talk about suffering being justified, we are talking about the agent's life. A lot of people think what I'm saying here is means to ends, and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we have to contextualize the suffering, whether or not it is right or wrong for God to not prevent it, within the agent's ability to eventually realize why it was important or meaningful to them. This is why it's so important that if there's any creature that cannot and lacks the ability to form that meaning-making journey, well, then it seems like God rigged the game against them from the start. What I'm proposing to you is, what if that's actually not the case? What if God has all the resources, which he does, he's omnipotent, to ensure that every creature can heal from all of their sufferings, and then form these unique identities about themselves that could only occur from the transformative experiences through suffering, and then show them how he loves them, how he did love them, and how he still loves them. So a being that cares about showing the creature that he loves them, having them understand he loves them, and defeating their sufferings where it no longer actually negatively affects them permanently, that being cannot be said to be a bad being, simply because your motivations and your character are determined, one, by your intentions, and then two, by how you carry out those intentions. This gets us into the phase 2 of the discussion. Motivations. Since God is maximally good, he desires the highest goods. Philosophers have discussed that what it means to be a perfectly rational being is to always be appropriately responsive to the reasons there are to do something. And so God will have all of the appropriate responses to reasons to do good. And so then, thus, God will be maximally good, because then God will have the ability to know exactly what the highest goods are, and then be motivated by those goods to the degree that those goods exist. So then God's motivated by the highest goods. Here's a hypothesis we can put on the table. The highest manifestations of agape love and transformative experiences are amongst the highest goods, which all require extreme suffering. Think about Jesus Christ as an example. Jesus Christ is what we would say is an example of someone to live by. All Christians say that, but even if you're secular or skeptical, you would say that as well. Not only because he said, hey, be nice, vaguely nice. No, but it was clothe the naked, help the needy, take care of the poor, feed the hungry, and then also die to yourself willingly for the good of others, right? The constant care for other people for their own sake. That's what agape love means, to will the good of another for their own sake. And we see this crescendo on the cross, right? Where the empty of himself, empty of all divine, to suffer on behalf of humanity out of love. Agape love is a self-sacrificial love. So contained within the very concept, logically requires suffering. An act of agape love is compassion. How can you be a compassionate person when there's nothing to be compassionate towards? Compassion requires sadness. How can you be a forgiving person when there is no wronging? How can you be a grieving person, right? Someone can grieve with. How can you be a self-sacrificial person, right? Without these forms. And when I say the highest forms of suffering, I mean the highest forms. And we see that example on the cross. So the highest forms of agape love require the highest form of suffering. So then we get this entailment. Then God desires a world that contains extreme suffering. You cannot get the highest manifestations of agape love within creatures unless that is a cost. However, that's not where the story ends. Here's a hypothesis. God works all things out for good. And this gives us two conclusions. No creature will ultimately lose out on this game we call life. God does not rig the game against you. God has set the guardrails up in this game of life where the sufferings that occur are not the kinds of sufferings where not even you or him in combination can allow you to heal, overcome, and transform yourself into a person that you desire, do not regret. And then conclusion 2, sorry, little conclusion 1 there. The game is not rigged against us, like I basically just said. If that's the case, then if the game's not rigged against us and no creature ultimately loses out, and God's works all things out for good, then God can simultaneously achieve a world with the highest manifestations of agapē-love, which are the highest goods, and creatures whose lives are not permanently maimed. There's no soul destroying, and actually every creature will come to consent to their existence, consent to how the suffering actually formed them into an identity that they would never wish away. The best of all possible situations. So, objections. There's really actually 2 objections that we can bottom this out at. Every argument from evil actually can fit within one of these 2 objections. Either there is obvious purposeless suffering, or there is too much suffering for any finite creature to handle. We have to be careful what we mean by purposeless suffering in objection 1, because purpose has to be defined by the value constraints within the theistic worldview. If purpose is some vague good out there that happens, that somehow outweighs the suffering, well, of course not, right? But if the purpose is for you to engage in this journey, in this narrative of life, where you make meaning out of even the worst circumstances to have the best transformations, such that you actually form a unique identity that is so good because of your suffering, then that is the point of suffering. And suffering provides us with the ingredients and the opportunities for us to do that. And because there's a lot of suffering, that means, by consequence, there's ample opportunity and ample chances for you to be actually to become that kind of person. And objection 2, there is too much suffering for any finite creature to handle. This is simply made on the observation that not everyone who suffers ends up, you don't actually end up observing them going through this entire process. But this assumes, again, not the truth of the Christian worldview, because the truth of the Christian worldview has contained with it an afterlife, where there's always going to be a post-mortem opportunity for every creature who suffers and loses their lives in this life. So to say that because you haven't seen a creature's total life, and because you've only seen a certain time slice of a creature's life and them not overcome their suffering, it's a faulty inference to say that they never will. Well, in the Christian worldview, they have ample opportunity to, and we can extrapolate based on the character of God that he will never allow any creature to fully flounder. So there's many other objections on the table I can entertain. What about animals? What about babies? In very specific examples, but I will allow the question Q&A time to take care of that. But with that, that is the presentation.
Thanks for that, Tim. All right, we're going to move towards the Q&A portion of our little meeting. By show of hands, who has questions so far? We got 1. We got 2. Yeah, we got 3. Okay, so since we have like 3 questions, and we asked that you only have like 1 or 2 questions per person. So yeah, we'll start off with you, Zach.
Send it around. I have to choose one.
Okay, yeah, no worries. Someone over here had one. Oh, okay.
It actually has to do with I'm pretty sure you were in Jubilee, like the video you're on. I didn't like whenever Alex was talking about the deer getting hit by the branch. I didn't really understand. I mean, what you were talking about, or like why that isn't a problem. Because I mean, like, what does a deer gain from that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish I would have been able to go into that with him before I got rudely voted off by my own side. What is up with that? People you think are for you, I guess not always the case. But yeah, so what Alex is doing is, again, presupposing values, and then the logical consequences of those values that were simply actually never even discussed, right? So he's assuming, right, that if suffering happens, it's to get something else outside the creature. So the creature, let's say the deer in this example, suffers, and it's supposed to produce some good somewhere, right? And that's supposed to somehow justify it. I actually disagree. I actually think that even if that deer suffered, And then that somehow led to, that was the only way for a utopia, the utopian society to come about, was through that deer suffering. I don't actually think that counts as justification, because you are objectifying the deer. You're saying that the deer's life actually only matters to get this utopian society, and there's no future or destiny for that deer. I actually think that justifications based on that do not actually take into account the sufferer's own value and identity. So if you notice in my presentation, I say that all God's authorizations of suffering, by the way, when I say authorization, I mean non-prevention. So God could either intervene or not intervene. When we mean by God being justified in intervening or non-intervening, it means God could do either or and still not be considered evil. And the reason why that is because that suffering is not, for that deer, is not soul destroying, and God will be able to communicate to that deer. So that kind of also gets into it. I have to unpack like my views around like the eschatology of animals and things like that. So that can be maybe a follow-up. But what matters here is that deer's life being good, and that deer understanding that it didn't relive a regrettable existence with respect to their suffering, right? And the only way that can happen is if the deer engages in a meaning-making process. There are values that we cannot dictate, and that can only be dictated by our own internalization of things. Let me explain. Let's take sentimental value. I can't determine what you have sentimental value over. So even if I give you a gift or I do something for you, it is up to you to internalize that subjectively for you to actually have sentimental value over it. That's not something, not even God can dictate and can actually determine, right, over and above our free choice, what we internalize as being valuable for ourselves. And so even if there was some vague good that deer was given, right, for their suffering, you still have the question unanswered on the table. Does that deer even consent or even care about that? How do they view their lives with respect to that? Do they know that God loved them, right? Do they actually not regret their life on the basis of the suffering because of how it contributed to them forming meaningful identities about themselves, right? And so what Alex is asking, his question is precluded from the start, given the rival set of assumptions that I've proposed on the table. So does that make sense?
He said yes.
Very good.
All right. And for the benefit of everyone, we ask that you speak your question loudly so that everyone can hear, because I personally had trouble hearing, but Tim have heard you just fine. So yeah.
Great.
Who else had a question somewhere around here? You did? Okay. I'll go to you.
Okay, so in your explanation, with that last question, it kind of raised a question to me. You said how that deer, like you don't buy the justification of the one deer for total utopia, right? Essentially denying like any utilitarianism sort of like arguments. So if you had to explain your presentation in like a framework, so to say, would you say that it's like the transformation and growth of one person's life closer to God? Would the framework be growth, or would you explain it in a different way?
I love this question. So I'm glad you asked this. And I wanted to include a part of this in my presentation, but luck of the draw, not everything makes it in. So thank you for asking this question. So yeah, so this then centers on, notice how I talked about earlier what the highest goods are. A lot of people come to the table, and by the way, I am asking your question, but I like to make sure that I provide accurate context for what I'm saying. There are competing views about what the highest goods are. If the highest good is happiness, right? If the only end of our existence is just only to be happy all the time, right? Kind of like this, the quintessential signature hedonistic world, and that's the highest good, and God did not abide by that, right? God being morally perfect, then desires the highest goods, then we'd have a problem here. But what I'm saying is, what if there's a rival framework, right? Way to think about this. What if the fulfillment and the satisfaction of our souls ultimately is transformative, meaningful experiences that crescendo in everlasting union with God? and that the highest quality transformative experiences take place in suffering. What if that's actually the case? Well, if that's the case, well, then this world doesn't actually seem to be too strange once you have that as the object, because then suffering provides an opportunistic background for creatures to freely participate in that journey.
Awesome. And did you have a follow-up question? Okay, sounds good. Cannon, did you have a question? Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, I had a question. It sounds really awesome, everything's transformative and soul building in a sense. How does that fit in with heaven and hell? Like if someone's going to hell, like would this, it kind of sounds like it might necessitate universalism in a sense if all things are being transformed into a beautiful union with God's soul building. It sounds great. What about egregious suffering? Obviously that's subjective, but let's say egregious suffering in somebody who has not chosen God, and let's say they're an adult, they haven't chosen God. How does this whole thing fit in with like the reality of hell, in your opinion?
Yeah, totally. And this is always the question that comes up. I actually have a follow-up question for you real quick. Keep the mic with them. I want to ask you, when you saw my slide and I put the hypothesis, God works all things out for good, do you agree with that or do you disagree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, so here's the cool part. Because we can't see into the future, but we have assurance that God works all things out for good, I actually can leave that question open as to what that looks like for the fate of every soul. If I have good, ample reason to believe God will work everything out for good, who am I to say that I know all the necessary and sufficient conditions for what it looks like for things to take place in the future in every exact manner that it could? But rather, I have assurance that whatever's going to take place is because God knows that that's the best thing to take place for that creature. And we can leave open, right, what that might look like. And hence why there's so many different views on the destiny of creatures on the table. I mean, there's actually 4 different views of hell, right? And there's not 3. People always think there's 3. There's actually 4 different views of hell. And they each, and for every view, there are several philosophers and theologians that disagree with each other about what they even mean in their entirety. So I don't think that's what's required for this project, is for me to be able to have that debate settled. But here's what I will say, though, about hell. A lot of people think, and this is a framework that every one of you guys can use when it comes to doctrines, there is what a doctrine fundamentally is, and then there is what a doctrine non-fundamentally is. Let me explain. When you read the New Testament, and you look at all the quote-unquote hell texts, right? It's pretty uncontroversial for a lot of ancient Greek scholars that the way the word eternal is translated into the English just means pertaining to the age or age to come. It's aionios. It doesn't, in the ancient Greek, it actually doesn't specify for us how long that is. It more accurately means age to come or pertaining to the age. Now, that the span of that age could be everlasting or it could be temporary. That's where the debate lies. So if we want to hold to the reality of hell as minimally as we possibly can, without entertaining all of these controversial debates, the best way to describe what hell is, it's a afterlife location where the unrepentant dead await some form of punishment for some period of time. That's it. It's an afterlife location where the unrepentant dead wait some form of punishment for some period of time. That punishment could be retributive or it could be rehabilitative. That span of time could be infinite or it could be finite. But minimally, that's what the New Testament tells us. And the Jewish precedents are there when you read the Old Testament. So if it's like, wait a minute, do any problems arise if I hold to that? There's some form. It's good to punish wrongdoing. Okay, great. And then it's for a period of time that I'm not given. Okay. Then let the debates rock, right? But you don't need to have those debates as a part of your doctrine, right? For you to be, to hold to hell, you don't need to hold to Jerry Walls's particular theory of eternal conscious torment or Andrew Hronich's particular theory of universalism. That's not what's required of you as a Christian. So that's what I would give to you.
Okay. Yeah, I can see how we don't necessarily need to hold to two to continue having the puzzle or problem of evil. I got you. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And then did you want to go?
Yeah. My question is kind of similar. So in your presentation, you said, I kind of have two questions, an initial one and then a follow-up. So in your presentation, you said, how is God justified in authorizing suffering? There's two ways: ensuring the defeat of all suffering in the victim's life, and indefinitely compensating the suffering. And then you also said that, and correct me if I'm mischaracterizing your position, if God works all things out for good, then no creature in turn loses. So my initial question is, would you say that the suffering of sinners is justified?
Can you elaborate? I'm sorry. I'm trying to find the relevant difference there.
Yeah. So like, this is just my initial question. So,
suffering
when I say sinners, I mean like
in relationship to what?
unrepentant. I think you muted it. Were you saying something?
Yeah, the suffering of sinners in relationship to what exactly?
Yeah. So like, somebody who is unrepentant, or somebody who's just like blatantly, willfully, knowingly a sinner, is their suffering justified? Is my initial question.
Well, yeah. So first, you have to understand, like, we have to understand that the framework applies to all suffering, right? Irregardless of context, right? Are you more so kind of piggybacking on the last kind of question where you're wondering like what's their fate ultimately with respect to that, or what do you say?
Yeah, like I said, my question was kind of similar to Ben's. Kind of where I was going with it was, if the suffering of unrepentant sinners is justified, then I don't have a follow-up question. But if it is or if it's not justified, and in turn no creature loses, and all suffering will be indefinitely compensated, then how do we reconcile whoever's not written in the book of life being cast into the lake of fire? Would be my question.
Yeah. So yeah, very similar. It's very similar to the last. I mean, like I said, what are the reasons why? And people might think like, man, why doesn't God just answer the question? The reason why is because there are a lot of debates around what exactly that looks like, with a lot of competing theses. But here's what I'll say is that there are people who believe that that the process of being thrown into the lake of fire, as you say, is actually a purifying process. Now, some people hold to a view that, hey, because the suffering will be defeated in an annihilationist way, it's because the person won't even exist, right? Or the suffering is justified in the sense that there is this eventual kind of purification that contributes to them engaging in that meaning-making process, where they don't consider their lives not worth living, but the purification process in the lake of fire is there to burn off the inhibitors that prevent them from ultimately freely coming to Christ. So there's that view. There's another view called the restorationist view, I think, or the reconciliationist view, where it really hinges on the kind of hyperbolic, kind of exaggerative language of that passage, and says, yeah, there will be a distinction between those whose names are written in the book of life, who will be within the kingdom, and then those outside the kingdom walls. Like, they'll still be able to like have goods, like they call them natural goods, right? But they won't have the good of ultimate presence with God. So they'll be able to defeat their suffering in that way, but they won't have this extra thing, right? These are views on the table. And the reason why I'm putting these views on the table is I'm more about getting you to see where your mind takes you with where you land on this. So I think that these views are compatible with either of those, but that's where the debate lies, right? And like I said earlier, in the end, right, a lot of these things are speculative in their nature, but these are kind of the best speculations that are on the table. I mean, even C.S. Lewis's view, right? He believed that the torment of those who choose to stay outside the doors, right? The doors are locked from the inside. Do so where they're actually not suffering forever, but they eventually just get steeped in their way after going through that period. So you also have the defeat of suffering that way. So there's a lot of views on the table, right? I'm not going to force you to pick which one, but food for thought for you.
All right. Hello. So I have one thing that I want to lay out real quick. I also had a question on hell that I wasn't going to ask, but then you mentioned the finite versus infinite debate, and that sparked something. And then I have a question after that. There exists a dichotomy in this way, because you have to believe in a finite hell in order for the defeat condition and infinite recompense to take effect, because people will have to eventually leave hell, find God, and then all their sufferings can disappear. You need a finite hell for that. However, if you have a finite hell, I think it could be argued you do not need to find earthly salvation, because sure, you're going to suffer, but on the eternal recompense view, well, you're just going to end up with God anyway. You may suffer for a little bit, but on the eternal recompense, that's all just going to go away. So I think that's something for you to work out. But my question is, you talked about consequentialism a lot, but the problem of evil, or the puzzle of evil, however you want to put it, exists across multiple ethical and moral frameworks. I actually think that it is strongest in a deontological view, which is most similar to like divine command theory, or with the morality laid out in the Bible. What is your, like, the responses in this way and soul building, these are kind of things I've heard before. I'm just wondering, what is your philosophical background?
So yeah, so I'll start with that part there. Well, place of agreement, I do think that a deontological argument from suffering is the strongest kind. Michael Tooley in particular has done that work. The atheist philosopher Michael Tooley in particular has done that work. I just disagree with the moral justificatory norms that Michael Tooley puts forth as deontic reasons that God has, right? And there's a lot of debate about this, where people are just putting forth different norms. It's like, okay, here's a set of deontological norms that Michael Tooley thinks best fit God's character, right? But again, if this is an internal critique, by the way, I still have yet to find a theist philosopher who actually holds to those norms. So he's critiquing a version of theism. I just don't know of any philosopher that holds his version, right? So he's critiquing something, right? He's critiquing something with deontological constraints, a very specific set of deontological constraints, but not the kind that any contemporary theistic philosopher that I know holds to. The defeat condition, like I told you, right? Suffering is authorizable insofar as that suffering can be defeated within a creature's life, right? That's a different set of constraints, and you can put those as moral norms. But then you can also go the route of the classical theist, who doesn't actually, that says that God is simultaneously personal but not a person. So moral agency cannot be ascribed to God in that way, in that really substantive way, and therefore moral norms, right, are not a part of the picture. Now, God's transcendent and simultaneously immanent in the moral domain, but he occupies a unique position, given that he transcends those categories. And so all it comes down to is, what's the best theory of perfect lovingness? And that'd be more so Marilyn McCord Adams' approach in her book, The Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God. She actually doesn't center it on deontological or moral norms at all. She centers it on, what can we extrapolate meaningfully? Like, what can we infer from a perfectly loving character with some concrete assumptions? That's what she would do. And the answer to your other questions, like Trent Doherty, for example, he wrote the book on the problem of animal pain. he said that you can frame actually the defeat condition just in a not an actualizing sense, but a potential sense. So all the evils that occur have this intrinsic potential to be defeated, but it makes no mention of their actuality for the thesis to be true. So there's that way. And then you mentioned the part about finite hell and motivations to not do anything. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that again, I think that rationality can be appropriately defined as, appropriately responding to reasons, right? And I think that if best interests, anything that we can kind of consider in our best interest is a reason to do something and a reason above all else to do something, then I would say that the person who uses that as a moral motivation to only come to God later because he has to, is actually acting not in his best interest. So acting irrationally, because that's not an appropriate response to reasons. So I think that a fully informed person who is properly functioning, so not motivationally defective, would actually cling very hard now to being a part of that journey and that future that will eventually come. So that'd be my way of addressing that. Thank you.
All right. Did we have any other questions for anyone? All right. Tim, where can we find you again?
Yeah, so it's WorldviewMastery on all platforms. I am particularly very active on Instagram. Getting more active. I try to repurpose everything for TikTok as well. And then YouTube for longer form discussions and videos as well. So if you want to get any deep dives and everything like that, you can find that on my YouTube. So every platform has a role and has a purpose. Kind of like the Trinity in the economic sense. Okay, sorry, that was a nerdy point for there. But yeah, you can find me in all those places, WorldviewMastery. And yeah, if you have any follow-up questions that you weren't actually able to get to here, my DMs are always open. So fire away. But yeah.
All right, everyone give it up for Tim Howard.
Thank you.
All right, real quick announcement. Next week is going to be a little bit of a topic by Tim McGrew. Not Tim Howard, but Tim McGrew on like the history of apologetics and ice cream socials in the works for coming up. So stay tuned for that in the group me. And thank you all guys for joining.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
See you, Tim.
You made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell for more content. Got questions or ideas? Drop them in the comments below. Until then, next time, thanks for watching. This is Patrick Boy Paul signing out. Peace.